Historiophilosohy. It's something I'm just trying to still work out. I'm not even convinced I like the sound of it as a term. It's pretty ugly, but it's the best I can come up with for the moment. So I'm hoping maybe I can just flesh it out for you guys today and see what you think and maybe work on it a bit more. But what I wanted to talk about today was Deleuze and Guattaris' last book, What is Philosophy, which came out in the early 90s. And in particular, I'm going to try and focus on, there's a chapter in there called the Geophilosophy, which you'll see is where I'm coming out with my term historiophilosophy. Now, this book, for those of you who are, maybe many here know, but for those of you who aren't aware, it's effectively divided into two parts. The first part, which in effect it does what the book's title says in response to the question of what is philosophy. And the second part then, in a sense, distinguishes philosophy from other endeavors such as science, logic, and art. Now, this book and this project, in my views, is still yet to be fully understood by much of the Deleuzian community, including myself. Largely, I think, due to the fact that it seems to jar with a lot of impulses that we Deleuzians had, in a sense, been, fostering in earlier works between Deleuze and Guattari. In particular, what this book does is it sharply distinguishes between different disciplines. And in that sense, it seems to go against the urge to, in a sense, do away with disciplinary boundaries, or at least be able to move across them in a more productive way. So, what I want to do in this paper is focus, just for today, on the first part, on the question of what is philosophy, and leave aside for the moment its distinction from science, logic, and art. And in particular, as I mentioned a second ago, what I want to do is focus on the last part of this definition. So, Deleuze and Guattari approach this question of what is philosophy effectively in two stages. First, they try and define what I refer to as the three principal or de jure principles of philosophy. After doing this, however, they then address what I would refer to as the second half of the project, which is, what is the relation between these principles and the various contingent relative milieus in which they both emerge, develop, and play out. So, in other words, it's this question of, the where of philosophy, the where of philosophical thought, because they're effectively saying thought always occurs somewhere. So it's if I was to sum it up as short as possible, the reason Deleuze and Guattari are using this word geophilosophy is because they're trying to understand the geography of philosophical thought, the importance of where philosophy occurs in terms of what is thought and who it is that thinks it. Now, in a certain respect, this is probably a far from novel insight. But I nevertheless think that there's still much to be gained from the manner in which Deleuze and Guattari set out and address the where of philosophy. And the first objective of this paper will just be to simply describe some of that importance of the project. The second objective of my paper, however, will be to as we go along, critique it as well. And in particular, what I want to try and pick at or push Deleuze and Guattari on is a distinction that they set up and employ throughout the geophilosophy, which is between geography, or the geographical nature of philosophy, and its effect, in effect, its nemesis, which is history. And what I hope to show by taking seriously Deleuze and Guattari's project of geophilosophy is that if we are to indeed follow them on pushing the importance of relative milieus to the nature of philosophical thought, then then philosophy should also be thought of as an historiophilosophy, and not just a geophilosophy. So that's in essence what I'm going to try and do, and I'm going to do it by, in effect, looking at the three principal milieus that Deleuze and Guattari go through in their analysis of geophilosophy. And these are ancient Greece, which is, they say, philosophy's past, modern Europe, which is philosophy's present, and then that which is in the process of coming about, becoming, which is philosophy's future. In each case, Deleuze and Guattari are going to demonstrate how the nature of thought is determined in part by particular geographical circumstances. Each time, however, I'll subsequently try and demonstrate how each milieu is as much historical in nature as it is geographical, and as a result, I hope to show how philosophy, in this Deleuzian sense, should be understood as a historiophilosophy. Okay, so that's kind of the scheme of what I'm going to try and do. So, to get into it, now, as I just mentioned, the presiding purpose of the geophilosophy chapter is to ask the where of philosophy, or philosophical thought. And as it turns out, we don't have to read very far into this chapter to get a very concise answer. Thinking, as they say, takes place in the relationship of territory and earth. According to Deleuze and Guattari's terminology, a territory is a socially structured space that is overlaid on the earth, which itself has no intrinsic social subdivisions. All thought, as this remark stipulates, involves a movement from one to the other. Thought is said to be deterritorialized when it is detached from a particular social territory, and it is reterritorialized when it conjugates with some new or other territory. There are, however, two types of deterritorialization. Deterritorialization is called relative when it concerns the historical relationship of the earth with the territories that take shape and pass away on it. Deterritorialization is absolute, on the other hand, when the earth itself is rendered relative to the structure of thought. Okay. So, while it might appear from such a description that absolute deterritorialization is of greater significance than the relative when it comes to the question or the production of philosophical thought, Deleuze and Guattari are quick to provide the following disclaimer. And this is a quote. They say, nonetheless, absolute deterritorialization can only be thought according to certain still to be determined relationships with relative deterritorializations that are not only cosmic, but geographical, historical, and psychosocial. There is always a way in which absolute deterritorialization takes over from a relative deterritorialization in a given field. That's the end quote. So all movements of absolute deterritorialization, therefore, can only be thought through the medium of relative milieus that actualize thought. As a result, even the very definition of philosophy's de jure principles, which the book had been largely concerned with up until that point, let alone its development, must be acknowledged to have come about for particular contingent reasons that arise from the nature of relative milieus. So, the first question Deleuze and Guattari ask is, so what did happen? Philosophy arose in ancient Greece, they say, due to the confluence of three elements: immanence, friendship, and opinion. Now, I'm just going to leave aside for the moment any discussion of these three elements because it's effectively irrelevant to the point I'm trying to make here, which is that philosophy arises because of three particular elements happening to come together in a particular milieu, in this case, ancient Greece. So philosophy did not just happen to arise anywhere, it arose in Greece at a particular time. In this respect, philosophy in its inception is and must be Greek. This, however, is not to say that we can isolate an internal principle of philosophy. On the contrary, philosophy's internal structure is dependent upon its external relations. As Deleuze and Guattari put it, using their idiosyncratic terminology, the birth of philosophy required an encounter between the Greek milieu and the plane of immanence of thought. We've acquired a conjunction of two very different movements of deterritorialization, the relative and the absolute, the first already at work in immanence. In short, philosophy does have a principle, but it is a synthetic and contingent principle, an encounter, a conjunction. It is not insufficient by itself, but contingent in itself. Even in the concept, the principle depends upon a connection of components that could have been different, with different neighborhoods. The principle of reason, such as it appears in philosophy, is a principle of contingent reason, and it is put like this: there is no good reason but contingent reason. There is no universal history except of contingency. End quote. Okay. So, philosophy, therefore, it has a principle, and this principle naturally defines what philosophy is. And as such, it presents necessary relations within that principle, between the various components. But this necessity was not always so. It had to, in other words, become necessary. This means that philosophy, as we know it, is only so due to, in part, the Greek milieu in which it arose. But this relation is as contingent as the nature of the Greek milieu is to begin with. If this milieu had been different, so too would philosophy, if it indeed arose at all. And the primary way that Deleuze and Guattari try and demonstrate this is by considering or taking into account the immense significance of Greece's geographical reality in order to effectuate the production of philosophy. As they point out, philosophy arose where it did partly due to the topography of Greece, which they describe as a fractal structure where each point of the peninsula is close to the sea and its sides have great length. They also say that Greece's unique regional location also makes it the, quote, the first to be at once near enough to and far enough away from the archaic Eastern empires to be able to benefit from them without following their model, end quote. So as we can see here, it's due to the region's variable and broken topology, as well as its bordering of an empire that it is still yet not within, that the Greek world is able to develop what Deleuze and Guattari refer to as a multiplicity of distinct societies that are separate from, yet informed by, the Orient. As it happens in their earlier books, Deleuze and Guattari make the same argument with respect to capitalism, but I'll just set that aside for a moment. Now, this constellation of independent cities is also better to accommodate, Deleuze and Guattari claim, those, what they call strangers in flight, who break from the empire on its eastern border. Deleuze and Guattari, for a number of pages, talk about and try and demonstrate the significance of the geographical topology of Greece in order or at least to point out its significance in giving rise to philosophy. By illustrating the great importance of geographical features to the birth of philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari are then led to conclude that, quote, philosophy is a geophilosophy in precisely the same way that history is a geohistory from Braudèl's point of view, end quote. Yeah, this is where the history starts to come in. This invocation of the historian Fernand Braudel, I believe, merits much closer examination. Now, for Braudel, who, for those who don't know, was a famous historian from the Annales School in the 20th century, history can only be appropriately understood if an appreciation is given to its geographical features. For example, in order to understand the economic crisis in Florence, Braudel says, between 1580 and 1585, one need first extend the scope of their research to Venice and Ferrara. From there, the role of trade with Far East will become apparent, but this influence is itself dependent upon the Moorish merchants who serviced the trade route through the Indian Ocean in the wake of the declining Portuguese. So, as we can see from this quite basic example, any significant history is at one and the same time a geohistory. Nonetheless, and this is my point here, it would be false to suggest that geography alone occupies a privileged position in Guattaris history. For example, sociology and economics are just some of the other social sciences which Guattaris' conception of history is strongly influenced by and in relation with. Now, I would add philosophy to this list. But must not history also be added to philosophy's list, the role that history plays in contouring the nature of philosophy? To say that the nature of philosophy depends upon a particular milieu is therefore not just to assert the importance of geography, since every milieu, as Guattaris' very work shows us, is as much historical as it is geographical. Now, this can be shown if we continue to follow the movements of Deleuze and Guattaris' argument in geophilosophy. In order to further flesh out how philosophical thought acquires a relation to relative milieus, Deleuze and Guattari realized that a second example is going to be necessary. Indeed, if they are to convincingly show how the nature of philosophy is in part dependent upon its relation to milieus, Deleuze and Guattari will need to not only show how philosophy could have been other, but how it is other to what it was. In other words, they will need to compare two instances of philosophy that are different, that have different relative milieus, yet are both philosophy definitionally. So, setting aside the birth of philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari then turn their attention to the re-emergence of philosophy in Europe, which brings us to the second milieu, modern Europe, or in other words, what they call philosophy's present. As we just saw, various conditions, geographical conditions, etc., of the Greek milieu combine to allow for philosophy's emergence. According to Deleuze and Guattari, analogous conditions come together once again in modern Europe. This time, however, the conditions are much more widespread. This is due, in short, to the pervasive dominance of Western capitalism. As the capitalist market, or what Deleuze and Guattari refer to as the axiomatic of capitalism, expands itself across the globe, philosophy, basically hitches a ride, taking advantage of the new geography that capitalism effectuates. Thus, as Deleuze and Guattari say, and this is a quote, modern philosophy's link with capitalism is of the same kind as that of ancient philosophy with Greece. From the point of view of philosophy's development, there is no necessary continuity passing from Greece to Europe through the intermediary of Christianity. There is the contingent recommencement of the same contingent process in different conditions. End quote. So, modern philosophy is thus inextricably bound up with what they refer to as the plane of immanence of capitalism as it spreads itself across the globe. But if philosophy is to capitalize upon this opportunity, or more specifically actualize this opportunity, an equally powerful force of reterritorialization will be required. And in Deleuze and Guattari's present investigation, this role of recapture in the process is played by the modern democratic nation-state. As Deleuze and Guattari acknowledged, this democratic state might seem a poor candidate for reterritorialization, since it's by no means a homogeneous or consistent territory. There are many different kinds of democratic states, with often critical differences between them, and none of them will, in a sense, be ideal in the philosophical sense. The lack of a universal democratic state, however, is no obstacle to the reterritorialization of philosophy. In fact, this is precisely Deleuze and Guattari's point. If philosophy differs today between various countries such as France, Germany, England, it is in part because of the ways in which these nation-states differ. For every realization of for every different nation-state, we thus have a different realization of philosophy. There are most certainly similarities between them, since all indeed meet the requirements for the definition of philosophy, but the fact that philosophy differs between nations is taken by Deleuze and Guattari as evidence for their claim that philosophy is geophilosophy. This is in a bit where things start to get a little bit comic, in my opinion at least. Deleuze and Guattari's comparison of modern philosophy in different geographical locations to illustrate the importance of milieu is specifically borrowed from Nietzsche. Now, not that I think Nietzsche's comic, but In his discussion of peoples and fatherlands, Nietzsche compares philosophers and artists from different countries, such as France and England, by referring to how they each reflect the general traits of their respective nations. He offers such opinions as, and I'm just going to paraphrase here, they are no philosophical race, these Englishmen. They have a profound normality and a certain narrowness, aridity, and industrious diligence, something English in short, which places them on the side of knowledge, rather than those who can do things in the grand style, the creative, end quote. Now, setting aside the issue of whether Nietzsche is actually onto something here, maybe, I won't say anything being Australian. The relevant question for our consideration, for our investigation here, is why do Deleuze and Guattari consider Nietzsche's determination of national characteristics to be specifically geographical? Is not history also an important factor in the determination of nations? One would think so, given that the majority of Nietzsche's remarks in this passage where Deleuze and Guattari are borrowing from actually refer to history and not geography. For example, geographical realities is certainly important to the passage, but the point I'm trying to make here is it's not even the point that Nietzsche is trying to make in this passage. As the passage indicates on numerous occasions, history is equally significant, if not more so. Thus, while geographical features might be critical in shaping the nature of a philosophy, it must be acknowledged that this alone cannot account for why philosophy should be a geophilosophy in Nietzsche's work, since other aspects, including history, are just as important to the national character of a philosophy. So, to take stock, twice now we've therefore seen how Deleuze and Guattari preference geography when asserting the significance of relative milieus to the absolute thought of philosophy. And twice I have now argued that historical reality is as significant as geographical reality in the determination of milieus, and thus their impact on philosophy's nature and definition. However, aside from this issue of comparative influence between geography and history, the fact that Deleuze and Guattari endorse a program of nationalistic characterization might seem a bit dubious to begin with. Deleuze, however, has previous with this sort of nationalistic description. As he says when speaking about literature, for those of you who are aware of or interested in Deleuze's work in literature, he says at one point, American literature operates according to geographical lines, the flight towards the West, the discovery that the true East is in the West, the sense of the frontiers as something to cross, to push back, to go beyond. The becoming is geographical. There is no equivalent in France. The French are too human, too historical, too concerned with the future and the past. They spend their time in in-depth analysis. They do not know how to become. They think in terms of historical past and present. End quote. Now, while such a statement is obviously guilty of indulging in gross generalizations, it is also entirely philosophical. Deleuze is here engaged in what you might say is an abstraction of consistent virtual events from a cacophony of actual states of affairs. So given that his goal is to in this case, to distill singularities of style, we must in turn admit that pointing out how historical fact is as relevant as geography to the makeup of a milieu does not really get to the heart of Deleuze and Guattari's project of geophilosophy. Just as Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy is largely immune to attacks mounted from various anthropologists and historians on factual grounds, so we must do more than just point to actual facts if we are to illustrate the importance of history to the nature of philosophy. Now, with this in mind, if this above quote on different styles of literature is particularly instructive, it's because not only does it differentiate between two national characters, it distinguishes between geography and history itself. In other words, it's not just that America and France differ geographically. Rather, one is geographical, while the other is historical. One concerns a perpetual movement across space, a geographical intensity, as Deleuze might say, while the other concerns a capturing and a representation of it, and historical extensity. So taking up this conceptual analogy again between geography and history, Deleuze and Guattari suggest in their discussion of geophilosophy that while French and German philosophy are characterized by the establishment and control of foundations, English philosophy, they say, has a nomadic nature that allows for, quote, a movable and moving ground, a field of radical experience, an archipelagian world where they are happy to pitch their tents from island to island and over the sea. So Deleuze and Guattari obviously have a much better opinion of English philosophy than Nietzsche did. They've got flipped it around there. It is this latter geographical form that Deleuze and Guattari clearly associate their definition of philosophy with, as well as we saw previously, ancient Greece and capitalism. But insofar as this is the case, how can the nature of philosophy for Deleuze and Guattari be in any way historical? Now, paradoxically, as I'm now going to try and show, it is in their discussion of philosophy's third relative milieu, which is none other than becoming, that history arguably plays its most important role, and in doing so makes possible an understanding of philosophy as historiophilosophy. So now I'm going to go on to the last section, looking at the third milieu, which is becoming, or philosophy's future. In writing this, I've always thought that this, this thing of philosophy's past, present, future, I can't get it out of my head, but I always feel like it's a bit of a Christmas carol to it. And I haven't been able to work it in yet. It goes to philosophy's past, present, future, but hopefully I'll get there. Okay, so philosophy's future. As Deleuze and Guattari conclude, their examination into the relation between philosophical thought and various relative milieus, the third and final one they explore is not found in the past of philosophy or its present status, but rather in its becoming. That which is in the process of becoming about, or philosophy's future. It is here, however, that philosophy as historiophilosophy is arguably at its greatest prominence. So, as we've just seen, the purpose of Deleuze and Guattari's geophilosophy is not simply show how philosophy is first born, or show how philosophy differs between different nation-states. If such were the case, then a simple contestation of their historical account, saying they got their history wrong, for example, or a recognition that philosophies differ greatly within any one nation, rather than singularizing an entire nation's style, would put this entire argument to rest. But arguing for a reduction of reality to either how it actually has been or an extensive location is not Deleuze and Guattari's presiding point or objective. Indeed, much of Deleuze and Guattari's work would suggest the contrary. For example, what Deleuze admires in a novelist is someone who can, as he says, speak like a foreigner in their own language. Someone, in other words, who can be foreign to themselves and thus differ from within. In light of this, philosophy must not only have a relation to milieus in the past and present, the form of philosophy must also have a relation to its future, what it is in the process of becoming, since by definition philosophy continually differs from itself, and is thus always becoming other. So for this reason, becoming is perhaps the most important notion in Deleuze and Guattari's entire discussion of philosophy's nature. The most important notion of the book, I would argue. Apart from its extensive use throughout the first three sections of the book, which set out the principles of philosophy, becoming is also, as it turns out, one of the very relative milieus that philosophy reterritorializes itself onto. Nevertheless, the question must be asked, does this promotion of becoming necessarily occur at the expense of history, as it sometimes, or quite often, seems? As it happens, the finale to Deleuze and Guattari's definition of philosophy focuses on this precise issue. In explaining why the principle of philosophy is contingent and not necessary, Deleuze and Guattari contrast their connection between philosophy and Greece with that of Hegel and Heidegger's. According to Deleuze and Guattaris' reading of Hegel, the Greeks are the first to produce the concept, since they are the first to grasp the object in relationship with the subject. This relationship emerges in three successive stages, as they say. 1, contemplation of the object. 2, reflection of the subject. And 3, communication of the concept with other subjects. But as Deleuze and Guattari point out, at the beginning of this process, it is not clear what distinguishes the anti-philosophical stage of the Orient and the philosophical stage of Greece, since Greek thought is not conscious of the relationship to the subject that it presupposes without yet being able to reflect upon it. So Hegel's as they would say, teleological philosophy of history, in which the Orient is prior to Greece, is therefore called into question by Deleuze and Guattari. Now, Heidegger, according to Deleuze and Guattari, displaces this problem in the history of philosophy, or his history of philosophy. For Heidegger, the Orient is not prior to Greece, but alongside, with respect to the difference between being with a capital B and beings. Thus, while the Orient and Greece coexist for Heidegger in a way that they did not for Hegel, the relation is as equally teleological, since it is reduced to the internal structure of being, according to Deleuze and Guattari. As they say, quote, "What remains common to Heidegger and Hegel is having conceived of the relationship between Greece and philosophy as the origin, and thus as the point of departure, of a history internal to the West, such that philosophy necessarily becomes indistinguishable from its own history." End quote. So in short, Deleuze and Guattari are claiming here that Hegel and Heidegger never take philosophy's external and contingent relations seriously, for they reduce them to an analytic and necessary principle. Because of this, the contingent and creative relation between philosophical thought and a relative milieu is replaced with a necessary and historicist relation. As Deleuze and Guattari say, Hegel and Heidegger remain historicists, inasmuch as they posit history as a form of interiority in which the concept necessarily develops or unveils its destiny. End quote. Now, what follows this, admittedly very brief critique of Hegel and Heidegger is a sustained discussion of the difference between becoming on the one hand and history on the other. By the end of this passage, we're left in no doubt as to Deleuze and Guattari's placing history on the side of necessity and capture, and becoming on the side of contingency and creation. However, if this attack on history is to be appropriately understood, I would argue, two facts must be acknowledged. Firstly, following as it does from a critique of Hegel and Heidegger, it is clear that by history, Deleuze and Guattari specifically mean historicism, that is, a form of history that they accuse of being teleological. And secondly, the alternative that Deleuze and Guattari endorse is directly credited to an historian, namely Fernand Braudel, who comes back again in this chapter. As Deleuze and Guattari note, the correct way to ask after philosophy's contingency is to do as Braudel did. Quote, "Why philosophy in Greece at that moment? It is the same for capitalism, according to Braudel. Why capitalism in these places at these moments?" And this is actually a question that Deleuze and Guattari have been interested in since their very first collaborations. Why does capitalism rise in the West when it does, as opposed to in the East centuries earlier, for example? To a certain extent, therefore, becoming, bearing in mind this, in a sense, this borrowing or use of Braudel's form of history, to a certain extent, becoming is not opposed to history, but if anything could be aligned with it, an ontology of historical creativity that is specifically other than what they call historicism. If we examine how Deleuze and Guattari take up the sharp distinction between becoming and history with respect to philosophy's reterritorialization on the future, these 2 points can again be repeated. The history that they speak of is an historicism that is incapable of genuine creation, and it's associated with a chronological conception of time. And if we look at the description of their alternative, we'll find that it is actually inspired by thinkers who each promoted an alternative kind of history. I'm just going to discuss very briefly, before I finish, two of these thinkers that Deleuze invoked at the end of his argument, Deleuze and Guattari invoked at the end of their argument in favor of, in a sense, a form of becoming as opposed to history. All of them, we'll see, are effectively historical thinkers. So take Charles Péguy, who's the first thinker that Deleuze and Guattari here, in a sense, deploy for their uses. As Deleuze and Guattari correctly note, for Péguy, there are two ways of approaching and understanding events. On the one hand, an event can be analyzed by noting how it arises and deteriorates in history. According to such an approach, the emergence, trajectory, and extinction of an event are graphed from a transcendent position above. But on the other hand, an event can also be intimated by installing oneself within its trajectory, by placing oneself within the movement of the event in order to become with it, as Péguy says. For Deleuze and Guattari, these two approaches describe precisely the difference between history and becoming. Such an assessment, though, I would argue, is not entirely correct. For what Péguy is more accurately attempting to illustrate for us are two different historical approaches. Two different ways, in other words, of doing history or understanding history, and explaining, in other words, an alternative historical ontology. Thus, while Péguy may be against a form of history that is causal linear and representational, it must be acknowledged that his work nevertheless remains infused by a profoundly historical sensibility. If Péguy was the leading critic of contemporary society in his day, it's not because he abandoned history or attempted to escape it, but rather the opposite. Péguy immersed himself in history in order to liberate the historical event and allow it to speak to us. This history is not exactly its record, the list of the events and states of affairs documented in an historical ledger. Instead, it is the events living, what Péguy would call the living past, its historical duration. I don't know, for those, maybe those of you know this, but Péguy was a famous essayist who actually attended some of Bergson's lectures at the time. So, in light of this, when Péguy installs himself in an event, he places himself directly in the depths of its history, a history that, in fact, continues to become. Péguy's writings testify to this time and again. As an example, take the seminal event of his day, which was the Dreyfus affair. After commissioning his friend Daniel Halévy to write a history of the affair for his journal, Péguy severely admonishes this account. Halévy's historical account, Péguy admits, records all of the factual details accurately, but it fails to capture the vibrancy of the events. Péguy's criticism, however, is not a criticism of history itself, but merely Halévy's kind of history, which is why Péguy then subsequently deems it necessary to write his own kind of history, in fact, in response to it. Now the same thing could be said for another thinker that Deleuze and Guattari also employ in this argument, which is Nietzsche. In Nietzsche's essay on the utility and liability of a history for life, which is one of the essays in the Untimely Meditations, Nietzsche famously draws attention to the importance of the unhistorical in fostering future life. But this is not all that Nietzsche has to say on the matter here. To begin with, the unhistorical is not itself a preferable form of existence or something to aspire to. In fact, Nietzsche strongly warns against this. He says, his examples, for example, one of his examples is a cow. I don't think Nietzsche's trying to say we should all become cows here. Rather, and most importantly, Nietzsche does not promote the unhistorical because he is against history. He is rather only opposed to those forms of history that are against life. Therefore, if anything, what the unhistorical is useful for is the project of a history for life, or a history for the future. Deleuze and Guattari, for the most part, fail to acknowledge this aspect, and in fact they quote a line from the Untimely Meditations maybe 4 or 5 times throughout their career, and they always cut off the first half of the quote, which says how Nietzsche is talking here as a philologist. But if we return to it, we will find that the unhistorical is developed by Nietzsche not to dismiss the creative capacities of history, but to release history from a historicism that Nietzsche felt he was surrounded by, so that it can promote the creation of future life. So, just to conclude, given these considerations, Deleuze and Guattaris' distinction between history and becoming, for the purposes of explicating the geophilosophy, must be treated with extreme caution. Contrary to first appearances, the discussion of philosophy's future, its third milieu of becoming, is not necessarily at odds with history. In fact, as it happens, Deleuze and Guattaris' explanation of philosophy's becoming as a milieu is itself inspired by and reliant upon a form of history, namely that one which is, being pushed by people like Peggy, Nietzsche, Braudel. This history may be distinct from the historicism of Hegel and Heidegger, but it is still, I would point out, a kind of history. And insofar as this project significantly draws upon the historical approaches of people like Braudel, it demonstrates how history need not be opposed to philosophical becoming, but perhaps could be an equal part of it. As such, Deleuze and Guattaris' analysis of the relation between philosophical thought and its various relative milieus shows us how history might not only be a geophilosophy, but also, perhaps, a historiophilosophy. And that's it. Definition. So, Deleuze and Guattari approach this question of what is philosophy effectively in two stages. First, they try and define what I refer to as the three principal or de jure principles of philosophy. After doing this, however, they then address what I would refer to as the second half of the project, which is, what is the relation between these principles and the various contingent relative milieus in which they both emerge, develop, and play out. So, in other words, it's this question of, the where of philosophy, the where of philosophical thought. Because they're effectively saying thought always occurs somewhere. So it's if I was to sum it up, is as short as possible. The reason Deleuze and Guattari are using this word geophilosophy is because they're trying to understand the geography of philosophical thought, the importance of where philosophy occurs in terms of what is thought and who it is that thinks it. Now, in a certain respect, this is probably a far from novel insight. But I nevertheless think that there's still much to be gained from the manner in which Deleuze and Guattari set out in the dream. This thing, historiophilosophy, it's something I'm just trying to still work out. I'm not even convinced I like the sound of it as a term. It's pretty ugly, but it's the best I can come up with for the moment. So I'm hoping maybe I can just flesh it out for you guys today and see what you think and maybe work on it a bit more. But what I wanted to talk about today was Deleuze and Guattari's last book, What is Philosophy, which came out in the early 90s. And in particular, I'm going to try and focus on, there's a chapter in there called the Geophilosophy, which you'll see is where I'm coming out with my term historiophilosophy. Now, this book, for those of you who are, maybe many here know, but for those of you who aren't aware, it's effectively divided into two: ancient Greece, which is, they say, philosophy's past; modern Europe, which is philosophy's present; and then that which is in the process of coming about, becoming, which is philosophy's future. In each case, Deleuze and Guattari are going to demonstrate how the nature of thought is determined in part by particular geographical circumstances. Each time, however, I'll subsequently try and demonstrate how each milieu is as much historical in nature as it is geographical, and as a result, I hope to show how philosophy, in this Deleuzian sense, should be understood as a historiophilosophy. Okay, so that's kind of the scheme of what I'm going to try and do. So, to get into it, now, as I just mentioned, the presiding purpose of the geophilosophy chapter is to ask the where of philosophy, or philosophical thought. And as it turns out, we don't have to read very far into this chapter to get a very concise answer. Thinking, as they say, takes place in the relationship of territory and earth. According to Deleuze and Guattaris terminology, a territory is a socially structured space that is overlaid upon the earth, which itself has no intrinsic social subdivisions. That's the where of philosophy. And the first objective of this paper will just be to simply describe some of that importance of the project. The second objective of my paper, however, will be to as we go along, critique it as well. And in particular, what I want to try and pick at or push Deleuze and Guattari on is a distinction that they set up and employ throughout the geophilosophy, which is between geography, or the geographical nature of philosophy, and its effect, in effect, its nemesis, which is history. And what I hope to show by taking seriously Deleuze and Guattari's project of geophilosophy is that if we are to indeed follow them on pushing the importance of relative milieus to the nature of philosophical thought, then then philosophy should also be thought of as an historiophilosophy, not just a geophilosophy. So that's in essence what I'm going to try and do, and I'm going to do it by, in effect, looking at the three principal milieus that Deleuze and Guattari go through in their analysis of geophilosophy. And these are parts. The first part, which in effect it does what the book's title says in response to the question of what is philosophy. And the second part then, in a sense, distinguishes philosophy from other endeavors such as science, logic, and art. Now, this book and this project, in my views, is still yet to be fully understood by much of the Deleuzian community, including myself. Largely, I think, due to the fact that it seems to jar with a lot of impulses that we Deleuzians have in a sense, been, fostering in earlier works between Deleuze and Guattari. In particular, what this book does is it sharply distinguishes between different disciplines. And in that sense, it seems to go against the urge to, in a sense, do away with disciplinary boundaries, or at least be able to move across them in a more productive way. So, what I want to do in this paper is focus, just for today, on the first part, on the question of what is philosophy, and leave aside for the moment its distinction from science, logic, and art. And in particular, as I mentioned a second ago, what I want to do is focus on the last part